feel great. The Cowboys are doing okay. I wish we could do the same for the Texans. We need a little help.
Barely.
Aren't the Cowboys undefeated?
Conventional
See, he's smiling?
medication.
No. You can come to the next one.
Yeah, I need to give you my son. Welcome to three. Welcome to three. He's at SMU.
Hi.
Hi. Good to see you.
I asked for your.
We're here at lunch. I don't want to sit here.
No, you're supposed to. I guess you're.
Good morning. Let's see, before we get to the CAAP committee and Javed, I have got to leave at about 9:25, and so just to make sure that in the cause committee, I think we have 3 of the 5 members of the cause committee here, and just to make sure that somebody could maybe take a break and, not bust the quorum, I'm going to appoint Javed Anwar today to the cause committee just for this meeting. So that's official. So Javed, if you could,
Ready to go? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Committee on Affordability, Accounting and Planning meeting. Please be advised this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and is being recorded. Agenda item number 2 is consideration approval of minutes for the June 19, 2019 committee meeting. Is there any questions or further discussion on it? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So moved.
Second, please.
I'll second.
Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Agenda item number 2 is approved. Agenda item number 3 is consideration of approval of consent calendar. This consent calendar does not, it includes non-controversial items that can be approved without comment or discussion. This allows us to save time for other items that needed more of our attention. The consent items are highlighted items in gray on the agenda. The following are the consent calendar for consideration. Agenda item 5D and proposed rules 5E2 through 5E8, 5E10, and 5E11. Are there any agenda items that anybody wants to move or remove from the consent calendar? Anybody, any questions? Anybody wants to move it? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So move.
Second.
Any, all A's?
Aye.
Okay, agenda item number is approved. Agenda item number 4 is a public testimony on item relating to the Committee on Affordability, Accounting and Planning. We do not have any registered to testify, so we'll go to the next item. Agenda item 5A is an update formula funding advisory committee. Dr. Julie Eklund, Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will provide a brief presentation and will be available for questions. This item is for information only. Dr. Julie Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Anwar.
Yes, ma'am.
And good morning, committee members. So 3 formula advisory committees have been convened this fall in preparation for providing recommendations for the next legislative session. I thought you might like a brief update on the work that they're focusing on this year, and so I'm going to provide a little background about the committees first and then summarize the commissioner charges to each committee. The committees are established as per statute, and I've included a couple of relevant sections here. We have a 2-year committee, which includes the Texas State Technical Colleges, the Lamar State Colleges, and the community colleges. We have a General Academic Institution, or GAI, committee, and that's, of course, the public universities. And we have a health-related institution committee. So here's an abbreviated timeline that describes the process. The board approved the committee nominations in July. Members are appointed on a 6-year rolling basis, so every biennia, about a third of the members are replaced. The committees are going to report their recommendations to the commissioner in January, and then March will come to CAAP, and the committee chairs will present their recommendations, and I'll share the commissioner recommendations. So there'll be, of course, a much longer presentation at that meeting. After the board approves the recommendations in April, the materials will be prepared to send to the Legislative Budget Board. So I have 3 slides that talk about the charges for each of the 3 committees. This one shows the community and technical colleges, and I've actually, although I'm not sure the handouts you received have it, we provided a star on the presentation showing the charges that relate to our rider and legislation, because this year the legislature actually provided guidance on several of the areas that they wish the formula advisory committees to study. So the first 2 charges for the community and technical colleges relate to the fundamental work of the committee recommending funding levels. The third has to do with critical fields. The legislature and the rider this session included some additional critical fields to be added to success points. They also included some extra weights for critical fields, which they're proposing that be included for the 2023 General Appropriations Act. And that revision included actually a large increase in those weightings. So the commissioner thought it was appropriate to ask the committee to specifically look at critical fields. And we, of course, had a major policy discussion at the July board meeting. It was broader than just thinking about the recommendations, but I do think that discussion will help inform the work of the committee. And in fact, I believe they're going to be watching a little excerpt from that discussion. The fourth bullet is a charge that results from the legislative interest in success point weights, and that's really to take a careful look at all the weights in terms of their current relevance. The fifth relates to 8-week courses, and this is something that we've added. Because 8-week courses are becoming more common at our 2-year colleges, and this is the situation where institutions will have a first 8 weeks and a second 8 weeks, and places like Odessa College have moved to having a lot of their students enrolling in this pattern. I think Odessa's up to 80%. We've had more and more colleges approach us about doing this. Because of that, it's important to consider how the funding mechanisms work for 8-week courses, because generally we don't receive enrollments for the second 8 weeks at the time we have to report to the LBB. So we did a little pilot during this last session, tried out a couple of approaches that the LBB had approved, and the committee's going to be looking at the results of that and making recommendations about whether one of those methodologies or a different methodology would be best for reporting those 8-week courses. The last charge relates to a change that the legislature made through rider and how transfer points are designated for success point purposes. So they have now included co-enrollment, structured co-enrollment programs in success points and funding for success points under transfer. And those are the programs where a student enrolls at a 4-year institution and a 2-year institution at the same time. And the program that's got the highest enrollments now is the program with Blinn and A&M. And so this change allows for students who are enrolling in those co-enrollment programs to be counted, their enrollments to be counted as part of the community college success points if they in fact complete 15 hours at the 2-year college before they move on to their coursework at the 4-year college. So that's the 2-year committees. In terms of the general academics, their charges were related to statutory requirements in some way, and the first bullet, of course, is the regular charge to recommend funding levels for the next biennia. The next 2 came from the past session in rider. The committee has been asked to look at the expenditure study and cost matrix it produces, as well as reviewing space projection models as they relate to distance education courses. So in this past session, fully distance education was funded at the same rate as non-distance education courses in terms of how our space model works, but the committee's been asked to consider changes to the model to account for some of the differences that might be there. So they'll be delving into that. And then finally, in terms of our health-related institutions, they're going to provide recommendations for levels. The commissioner also charged them with looking at funding for medical students who earn dual degrees. This is becoming more common. We haven't seen a lot of it, but it's getting more common. I know for the Dell Medical School, students are expected to earn dual degrees. So we wanted to make sure the committee took a look at how the funding works for that to make sure it's equitable. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the commissioner charges and the work of the committees.
So what kind of guidance, I mean, I remember there were really two parts to their recommendation last time. One was, the graduation bonus,
Yes.
which we had encouraged them to consider. And then there was the formula, right? In other words, for growth of population and just enrollment projections. Is there anything else? I mean, do they just talk about those two things and that's pretty much it? Or what other sort of guidance or innovation or other discussion is there on these committees?
So the commissioner provides these charges to help to structure the conversations, and sometimes we also get feedback from committee members regarding areas they think it's important to take a look at. And so basically the charges that I just walked you through, they're going to be looking at each of those in detail. In some cases, for example, with the two-year colleges, they're breaking out into work groups to look at their charges and think through where that should be. For the four-year institutions, I believe, in fact, they do also have a work group to look at the expenditure study, see what's happening with that, to look at the recommendation that they consider distance education and the space model. So they've got a work group that's looking at that. So in addition to sort of the big picture, what should the recommendations be for the funding weights moving forward, for the funding amounts, they also will be looking at these specific charges.
And we have a representative of staff at the committee, or do they just function on their own?
Yeah, we have staff representatives. There's someone on the funding division that supports each committee. We run a lot of data for them so they can look at different models with different funding possibilities if they want to examine different changes that could affect the funding rates. But the committees have their own chair and co-chair, and they do serve as independent committees that way. But we provide a lot of support.
But we're plugged in.
Oh, yes,
We know what's going on.
we are very much so, because it's our, if you go back to the charge, it's our charge to provide to review the formulas and to provide the recommendations to the LBB and the governor and the legislature. So, thank you.
Any other discussion or questions? If not, we move on to agenda item 5B, is 60 by 30 Texas Data Insight, high school to higher education data. Dr. Julie Eklund, Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will provide at present and will be available to answer any question. This item is for information only.
Okay, thank you. So this presentation is a follow-up to the July presentation of the 60 by 30 Text Annual Progress Report. I'm going to be providing some additional details on factors that have contributed to our lack of progress on the percentage of high school grads who enroll directly in Texas higher education, because that was one area that everyone was concerned about in terms of when we looked at our progress on all of our goals and targets. As you may recall from that presentation, the state has remained at about 52% on this target for the last 3 years, and we are well short of our 2030 target of 65% of public high school graduates enrolling in Texas higher education. In fact, the current percentage has actually decreased slightly from last year. So to try to better understand the stagnation, we're going to look at shifts in demographics, high school graduates who apply to college but don't enroll, some labor market participation, and other factors. And I'm also going to share a few hypotheses that don't appear to have a significant impact on college enrollment, but they're often raised by the field. So both the K-12 and higher ed sectors will need to enhance the level of outreach and support to students in order to reverse this trend. So it's important to keep that in mind throughout. Yeah. And I'm going to conclude with some strategies and opportunities for action. So why is direct enrollment important? Well, there are clearly wage benefits, earnings benefits for students who enter and complete college programs, but the timing of enrollment is also important. Those students who enroll immediately after high school graduation have a higher percentage of ever completing college, of college readiness, and of certificate and degree completion. So higher rates for those. And when students enter and complete more quickly, they begin gaining those wage benefits earlier. They're out in the workforce. So students who enroll in college directly are likely to face fewer conflicts from work and family commitments than students who delay. So that's also important to remember. And this slide, of course, shows some of our wage differentials across degree types. So in the most recent year, the direct high school to college rate fell statewide by a little less than 1%. Everything averaged out to 52%, but again, we're seeing this slight drop. And there were also decreases in 7 of the 10 regions, including large decreases in rural areas such as West Texas, the Upper Rio Grande, and the Northwest. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to. No region in the state increased on this metric, although in 3 regions the state was essentially flat, and that was in the Metroplex, Upper East, and Gulf Coast. Now, in terms of the rate, we also have to consider the number of students enrolling. And we have seen increases in the number of high school grads enrolling in college every year since 2015. The number enrolling directly in college has increased by about 13,000 students. However, at the same time, the number of public high school graduates has increased by much more, about 32,000 students. And that's why we have that almost 1% decrease in the rate. Large increases in the number of public high school graduates stem from 2 factors. The first, Texas has a young, rapidly growing population, and the second is that high school graduation rates have increased from 86% in 2011 to 90% in 2017. So that's a positive improvement. From a higher education perspective, these changes mean we must work harder to support students on the margin of high school graduation who are not likely to enroll in higher education. So that's an important population to reach and a growing one. So the share of public high school grads who are Hispanic has grown by about 2 percentage points since the start of the plan, and Hispanic graduates make up 50% now of all Texas public high school graduates. And because Hispanic, African American, and economically disadvantaged students enroll at lower rates, as these populations grow, we will continue to see decreases in our rate unless we improve the college-going rates for these groups. So we were at about 49% of our Hispanic graduates directly enrolling in higher ed, 47% of our African American graduates in terms of the most recent year, but at 53% for our white graduates and 69% for our Asian and other graduates. So we need to make improvements across the board, but particularly in those underrepresented populations. The next explanatory factor we discovered relates to what is sometimes called summer melt, and that's when students apply to college, they're accepted, but they never enroll. We don't find them enrolled. So in addition to the 52% of grads who enrolled directly in higher education right out of high school, 21% applied, but we didn't find them enrolled in Texas. And of that, 3% of high school graduates not only enrolled, but were accepted at a university, and we didn't find them in Texas higher education. The percentage of summer melt students has been on the rise. And the fact that we have students who are taking the effort to apply to college, there's many steps, and then not enrolling is concerning. So I think this group is a ripe population for additional support to help achieve our targets. In fact, if all students who applied also enrolled the following fall, the direct college enrollment rate would exceed that 60%. I do want to mention that we do have a population that enrolls out of state, students who apply to college in Texas and then will enroll out of state. But those patterns have remained pretty consistent over the years, and we've seen an increase in the summer melt percentage. So something we need to keep an eye on. The next factor we looked at was labor market participation. 48% of high school graduates who aren't found in higher ed, and about 25% of those we find employed. Male high school grads are more likely to be in the workplace, and that's true for all race ethnicity groups. As well, that males are less likely to be enrolled in higher education. The remaining 20% 23% of the high school graduates we don't find in the workforce or in higher education in Texas. Graduates may be, also I just want to mention, graduates can be employed but don't appear in the data. We do have some groups such as the military, self-employment, or of course students who are working outside of Texas who we wouldn't find. But the important thing is that we look at some of these patterns and we're seeing changes. The other group that we have looked at are students who directly enrolled in career schools. That's about 1% of the population. They're not included here because we have a delay on that data. We don't get it for a year later, but that clearly isn't making up a large percentage of those students who aren't coming in directly from high school. So even though unemployment has been at record low levels, we haven't seen big changes in labor market participation among the high school grads. The percent of grads who are employed but not enrolled has increased by about 1% since 2015. That's about 10,000 high school graduates. And median wages for high school graduates are relatively low at just $14,000 per year. Wages have increased modestly by about 3% since the start of the plan. So we believe that neither growing rates of employment or high wages seem to provide the explanation often cited that graduates can easily make high wages directly out of high school. In fact, we pulled a little more data on this to give you at least a little sampling of what we see at the highest levels. So as I said, most high school graduates are finding low-wage employment jobs, but on this slide we show the 3 highest-paying industries for high school graduates in the workforce. These industries do offer the opportunity for high employment wages, such as demonstrated by the 90th percentile wage we see in the first group there, which is support activities for mining, and an average at the 60,000 wage. However, we find highest at 60,000, as you can see, on average in the 30,000 range for the median wage. But on the right-hand column is what's important here. We find a very low percentage of our high school graduates in these groups, in these high employment industries. In fact, the top industry for high school graduates directly entering the workforce is restaurants and other eating places, and that's almost 25% of the graduates that we see. So, students, educators, policymakers are often quick to cite that student making $80,000 working in oil and gas. These anecdotes are powerful. There's some truth in them, as you can see, but this group is not very representative of the vast majority of high school grads who go to work rather than pursue higher ed. We explored a couple of other common hypotheses in terms of stagnant direct enrollment, but none of these have proved to have much explanatory power either. We have seen, in fact, a decrease in the students who delay college and take a gap year. I think you're probably familiar with that terminology, students who deliberately wait a year before they enroll but intend to enroll. But we've seen a decrease in those numbers. Our out-of-state enrollment, as I mentioned, has remained stable. And some people point out that we have a lot of students who are, or we're growing in terms of the population that are completing credentials while in high school, the certificates and associates through early college, high school, and other dual credit programs. But when we look at that population, 80% of those students who complete a certificate or associate and graduate from high school, we find enrolled the following fall in higher education. And of course, that 80% is much higher than our 52% statewide. So that doesn't explain much of the difference. And so I want to talk a little bit about interventions to support direct enrollment in college and sort of what we should be thinking about from this data in terms of that. So I think we need to focus on populations that will need more robust academic preparation, advising, and financial support. I talked about rural students, economically disadvantaged students, and I think for every, and also, overall, I think we need to consider the changing demographics and make sure we're supporting our underrepresented populations. We see a growing number of students who are applying and not enrolling, and I think this was a real takeaway from some of the work that we did. We want to make sure they do more than just apply. We want to make sure they're not encountering barriers to entry after demonstrating that interest. We have recently begun intensifying support for regional 60 by 30 text advisory groups by awarding some grants and some to rural areas to concentrate on the high school to higher education targets. So we prioritize that and some grants we've given to regional groups, and they're really trying to focus on this in this area and make improvements. And then finally, I think students need to better understand the realities of labor market opportunities that are available to them. And the path to a living wage is more likely with a certificate or degree in hand. Finally, I did want to mention HB3 because I think this is an important opportunity for improvement in this target. The Comprehensive School Finance Bill, which passed in the most recent session, includes several key provisions that could make a significant impact on student preparation and enrollment. And it includes college, career, and military readiness plans, increased funding for college prep exams, college readiness incentives that will reward districts for college-ready students who enroll in college the following fall, and FAFSA as a graduation requirement for high school students. And I believe you'll be hearing a little bit more about some of this later from Mr. Booker. And although the bill's requirements fall on K-12, it's critical for our higher education institutions to partner with K-12 to help provide capacity and expertise to make the most of these opportunities. So I hope these insights have helped separate out some of the fact from fiction on this topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead.
Is the system set up to where there's enough transparency to determine what percentage of our students enroll out of state within the 21%? Because that's low-hanging fruit if we can figure out how to.
It sure is. And we have had National Student Clearinghouse data in the past. This session, we were very pleased that the legislature gave us funding to have that data moving forward. So at least for the next biennium, we're going to be able to acquire the National Student Clearinghouse data tracking high school grads to higher ed. The last time we had a full set of data ended in 2016, and we saw that about 5% of all high school graduates enroll out of state, and about 10% of all students who do enroll in college enroll out of state. So that makes sense in terms of having about a 50% rate. And that had remained steady for years. Even a few years ago when we looked at that, everyone was saying, no, we really think more students are going out of state. That's why these numbers are dropping. But it was steady. So we'll be really excited to get that additional data this year and see if that pattern has remained the same or if we are seeing increased enrollments across the country and not in Texas.
Yeah, because I would assume that most kids that are applying out of state also apply to an in-state school as a general rule. And so that's why, and so where I'd be curious to see of that 21%, what's the net that aren't showing up?
And it's going to be, based on the past history, it's going to be less than 5%, because if it's 5% overall, we don't know, some students don't apply to it in Texas, just apply out of state. But even if that's 3 or 4%, we know there's a large percentage of students who are applying and not enrolling, and that includes to the community colleges.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Just one comment. I've bring up periodically that I continue to be concerned that there's been so much writing nationally about is college worth it. Virtually every day I find another article saying, is college worth it? And so I think that there's a message that's going out from a lot of places raising that question, and I wonder if we need to do something specifically to address that and to encounter it for the college-going population in a way we did with closing the gaps. We have not done that, and even there was a recent article I read. Actually, it was at MSNBC. I was by a guy named Paul Tuff, who's written a lot, talking about all the talk about welders and the real truth about how many, the wages associated with welding and how many people actually get jobs. And so there's information going out that suggests, as Julie was saying, that there are high-paying jobs where there may not be. Welders can be very specialized, and the most specialized welders do, in fact, make a lot of money, and they're hard to find. But do we need to address that in some way to at least let people know? Julie showed the information we typically see on increased income over a lifetime. One thing it didn't show is there's also a much lower unemployment rate for people who attend some level of college. And also when they're unemployed, they're, at least the past statistics showed that they're more likely to be reemployed sooner. So I think there are things that we just need to think about going forward in terms of more complete information for students.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that the percentage that you said of those, quote, high-paying jobs is such a teeny. I was actually going to talk to Mr. Anwar about getting me a welding job in Midland, but now I'm kind of disappointed that there may not be as many of those available.
You're more than welcome. It's still booming. Only thing is that you have to find a place to live, maybe a pipe, big one, or one of those man-made camps. Commissioner?
Well, and I think it is interesting, if you look at the regions, what's happening. If you look at West Texas, they're down significantly compared to other regions. So there could be some connection, again, between some of those high-paying jobs and what we're seeing in terms of the decrease in West Texas. So we'll monitor that carefully. So the economy, again, may be having some type of an impact, but there's an awful lot of students we don't find employed or enrolled. Yeah.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I have it's entirely speculation on my part, but I think of all the activities that high schools and school districts mount in the senior year of high school students, and I think it's kind of in my own mind I've come to call it the revival effect. That you have people that are subjected to all of this push and all of this pressure to think about going to college. And so when they're in school, their senior year, they apply, they get offers of enrollment. And then over the summer, without that constant reminder of how important going to college is, that enthusiasm fades away. I think that that more of our universities, particularly universities, but in some ways this applies to community colleges. I think the best solution to deal with the issue of summer melt, don't give them the summer off. You know, enroll them in college right away. A lot of students could benefit from a certain level of remediation in the summer, get a head start on the fall semester, but get those students enrolled in college as soon as possible. Football, college football teams figured this out a long time ago, that you want to get those kids on campus as soon as they graduate, not wait till the fall. And I'd like to see more emphasis on robust summer programs and with a particular focus on dealing with under-preparation.
The other thing that we did decide we need to dig into a little more, get some more information about, is whether there's been a growth in sort of the initiatives where all students at our school are expected to fill out a college application. You've probably heard of that type of initiative where students are encouraged to apply to the local community college. And if there's been a growth in that type of approach, which can be a very positive approach, that could have something to do with these increasing numbers that we've seen of students applying and then not enrolling. But that's one area we need to understand better, because I think that's something initiative that has been out there a while, but perhaps there's been some changes in terms of how that's approached. And certainly, once they do apply, we'd like to encourage them to enroll in any way we can, even if that wasn't their initial intention. So.
Go ahead, Mr. Farias.
Yes, Dr. Eklund, also, I had to step out a little bit, but you may have covered this, but now with the free tuition that a lot of the universities in the state, another announcement this past Monday, I think that also will help improve the numbers and hopefully keep people in state. So, I mean, there's other incentives that I think that universities and community colleges as well are, trying to let people know that college is more affordable.
And I think that being discouraged about costs, and I'm sorry, being discouraged about costs, it could be one of the reasons why we're seeing some of the decline. So making sure students are aware of what's available for financial aid and these types of programs will be important.
That's part of what I neglected to mention earlier is with Closing the Gaps, we made a deliberate effort to help students know there was money available, because they don't know about many of these problems. They don't know if they're economically disadvantaged that Pell Grants will cover their tuition and fees at a community college. There are other things they have to work with, but for other students, there are other means to help as well. And we need to do a better job of advising them of that and advising them of the individual universities who have set up plans like you were addressing just then, so they'll know that. And it could be that we could put together some information that not only addresses what we help provide in the federal government, but also what individual institutions are, and making a brochure or something that we could, and a site where we could provide this to all the college, the advisors at high schools to share with their students, so they'll know, and they'll know that there are options, and it may make them realize, well, perhaps we couldn't go where I thought, but if I go to this other institution, it won't be totally free because I'll probably still have to buy books, but it's going to be a lot cheaper than I thought it would.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's not hard to do.
Right, and UTRGV just added plus $500 to students to buy books and other fees. But also, what a lot of people don't realize, when you look at the details, it's just not just to go to college, but they also, as a freshman, there are guidelines. You need to have like an 1100 on the SAT, and so it's just not anybody can get in there. So we want to stress quality as well. So that's important to realize.
Is it feasible for us to sponsor some sort of pilot program where we go, pick 3 junior colleges and 3 colleges, and we go in and kind of hold their hand and help them in high school, educate the students, and just see what the results are, to prove the results of, really educating them on the affordability and the colleges on, back to your point, Commissioner, of, more touch points during the summer, require them to come a couple of times during the summer so you don't lose them in. But is that feasible to?
I think, hasn't E3 done some of that work? They try to deal with summer melt by keeping in touch with high school.
Funded the
Yeah.
Austin Chamber
Yeah.
a few years ago with that. And what happened in that case is, as I recall, AISD actually provided some extended time to their high school counselors in the summer to stay in contact with those students. But we do have some things going on in Drell's division, working with folks. So I think we clearly, if the board would like, we could do that. And I think I should also say we can learn from some of the institutions as well that are doing some very good things already and extend that to other campuses. So I think we should pursue something like that.
Okay, go ahead.
So being in West Texas, I've definitely seen how a lot of the false narratives play out with going and getting those $80,000 plus jobs straight out of high school. But I feel like a lot of this comes from the lack of advising in the K-12 system, because they're playing so many roles in rural areas. In one instance, there was a high school advisor that was also like the junior high principal, and she taught 3 classes. And so there's a lot of lack of information. And I know you talked about the grants that are going into those areas, but does the Advise Texas program service rural areas at all?
Drell, they're primarily in urban areas. Do we have any at all serving? I didn't think so.
Good morning, Jarrell Booker, Assistant Commissioner, College Range Success. Advise Texas generally is in a lot of the urban areas closer to the partner universities as far as for training and management of the advisors, which are near peer advisors. We try to have close driving distance to some of those places, but what we're doing most recently is we have a virtual advisor called ADVI that many of you are familiar with. We're going to really pilot that in West Texas in rural areas. That's going to be happening this year because we do think there's a lack of advising in those areas, and we think all those students should have access to the same sort of advising and training that the Advise Texas advisors have. And the virtual advisor with it's artificial intelligence with a live person also there if it needs to. We'll offer that to that area for sure, and we think that's the best place to put it and start it for next year.
Of course, the student has to be thinking about college to begin with if they use ADVI. So we have to remember they're just not going to miraculously show up there. Those that are thinking about college already, we can help that. But I think there are a large number of students that are capable and should be thinking about college. They just see it as an impossibility that we need to find a way to reach. And
one thing I'd want to say, some of the places are even reaching out to the students themselves, and the nudge that they call it, and there's a lot of research recently on nudge, but the counselors, if they're getting something from their counselor, someone they know, they're more inclined to pay attention to it, to follow up. The virtual advising is also good for parents. They don't know enough to ask, so now they can actually ask questions that way. For Mr. Wilson, the The summer melt program is also part of that. We can actually reach out to the students during summer. Hey, by the way, you applied. The counselor said to reach out to you. If you have any questions, kind of hold their hand through that entire process. We're going to revisit the Austin Independent School District Chamber summer melt program we did a few years ago. We're going to revisit that with a research grant here in the next year or so. So all those things are in play. Your thinking's right on point, because that's what needs to happen periodically. Some districts do it naturally now because it was a success, but with 1,200 school districts, you're not getting enough across the board who are finding it to be as important. So we're hoping to highlight it so more will do it themselves.
Has there been any discussion on expanding the partner schools for Advise Texas?
There has been. It's an expensive program. So the state gives us $2 million or $4 million for the biennium. There has been some discussion about that. The original design of the program came from the College Advising Corps, which required the partner institutions to have at least an 80% graduation rate. So at that point, you've narrowed that pot for the state of Texas to maybe 8 schools at that point. So, but that's a constant sort of discussion that we have, and we'd love to expand it as much as we can, because it's a real value, which I'll discuss during the cause meeting about the value and what the research has come back on.
So Chairman Anwar, if I may say, Mr. Booker and your group and your staff and your division coordinator do a lot of great work. So for you that don't know, we visit quite a bit on the phone before each meeting, and you'll listen. He'll have a report on the cause committee later on this afternoon, but I just wanted to let people know this is the type of programs Advise Texas and things we're doing for students and families that I think a lot of the state doesn't realize, but it's really important. It makes impact in people's lives and higher education. So I just wanted to thank you and your group, your staff, for all the good work that you're doing. And that I've learned that you've done the last couple of years of what you do, that's really amazing and making an impact in people's lives in higher education, and being able to get advised and have good opportunities and know what's out there. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I live in West Texas in Midland. I've seen these booms come, and then all of a sudden the boom is gone and these people are unemployed. I mean, it's not a steady rate of unemployment, So what we do with our oil company, we encourage those people who are office worker, young people, make sure they start taking some college classes, and we give them a little time off if they have to go to college. That way, even when the things are not that good, they're at least getting ready to go to full-time college if they need to. That really helps. Now in the oil field, it's very hard to give time off because they're out there in the middle of nowhere, quite a ways away from college or any institution. But that's one way to consider helping these students out. Thank you. I guess no more discussion. We move on to agenda item 5C is consideration of adopting the staff recommendation to the committee relating to the report of student financial aid in Texas higher education fiscal year 2018. General Appropriation Act, House Bill 1, Article 3, page 3, 265-86, Texas Legislative Regular Session. Dr. Charles Puss, Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Student Financial Aid Programs, will present an overview of the report and will be available to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. The annual financial aid report is a statutorily required report by the General Appropriations Act. The report pulls together a wide variety of financial aid information, from a broad-based overview of financial need across the state to detailed accounting of the number of students receiving each type of aid at individual institutions. It's a data report similar to the Almanac and serves as a starting point for financial aid-related research and discussions. It's utilized throughout the years as a key resource for answering legislative and media inquiries. Several changes occurred for this year's report, which impact how data is presented and our current ability to assemble trend data. Deshae Reed, our Director of Financial Aid Services, led a multi-year project to redesign and improve the collection of financial aid data from institutions. The data collected serves many functions, such as reporting, allocations, reconciliation, forecasting, and compliance. In addition to the database redesign, the report was also redesigned to include more students. Prior iterations of the report looked solely at students who filed a financial aid application, typically the free application for federal student aid or the Texas application for student financial aid. However, quite a number of students receive aid through programs that don't require a need-based aid application, such as merit scholarships, athletics scholarships, exemptions and waivers, or federal VA benefits. So the changes to the database and the report allow us to capture and report more comprehensive details regarding financial aid across the state. Broadly, over 867,000 undergraduates received some form of financial aid in fiscal year 2018, with total financial aid to undergraduate students exceeding $9.6 billion from all sources. To put this in context, this pie chart indicates the sources of financial aid. As you can see, the federal government provides the majority of financial aid to Texas undergraduates at 57%, primarily through the Pell Grant and direct loan programs. Institutions are the next largest contributor, providing over 30% of financial aid received. Exemptions and waivers represent about 15% of that funding, while set-asides represent about 12%. And then state and private sources come in third and fourth at 7.5% and 5.4%, respectively, of the total sources of financial aid. Another way to look at this is by the type of financial aid received. Grant aid accounts for almost 57% of financial aid received by undergraduate students. Institutions are the largest grant providers at over $2.5 billion. The federal Pell Grant program is a close second, providing over $2.1 billion. State appropriations provide just about $570 million, or 10% of the grant funding. Loans account for just over a third of the total financial aid awarded, with 89% of those loans coming from federal sources. The state's College Access Loan Program accounts for just about 4% of undergraduate borrowing. Now, financial aid for graduate students is quite different than those for earning an undergraduate. Over $2.7 billion in financial aid was provided to almost 142,000 graduate students. As you'll see in this slide, 60% of financial aid to graduate students is in the form of loans. Now, one thing to note is that support for graduate students often comes through stipends as well, which aren't represented on this chart, as they aren't reported through the financial aid database. Including support from stipends would reduce the prominence of loans in this chart. However, loans would likely continue to be the largest source of funding. As you've seen in other presentations on higher education financing, net tuition and fees per full-time student equivalent has increased over the past 2 decades, while overall state appropriations per full-time student have been declining. This slide shows how this has played out in our major state financial aid programs. The Texas Grant Program has fared the best, with increased appropriations in every legislative session. However, funding has not kept pace with increasing college enrollment and the statutory expansion of eligibility. Only 70% of eligible students are projected to be funded in this biennium. Appropriations for the Tuition Equalization Grant, serving students at private institutions, have seen both increases and decreases over the years, and currently stand just below the appropriation level from the 83rd legislative session. The Texas Educational Opportunity Grant receives 2 appropriations based on the type of 2-year institution. The community colleges saw a small increase in the 85th legislative session, and the state and technical colleges have not seen an increase since the 84th legislative session. These programs only fund 19% and 13% of their eligible populations, respectively. Appropriations for the Texas College Work-Study Program have not increased since the 83rd legislative session. I am happy to answer any questions you may have about this report.
Any questions or discussion? Commissioner?
Chad, do you know where Texas stands in terms of other states in regard to how dependent we are on federal financial aid?
I don't have that figure, but that's definitely something that I can find out and let everyone know.
Yeah, I think at one point we were number one in the country in the percentage of financial aid that came from federal sources compared to state or institutional sources.
I'll look into our dependents.
That's one of the reasons that that John White and I have tried to go to Washington on a regular basis to make sure the members of the Texas congressional delegation know how reliant Texas is on Pell Grants. That's something I hope we keep doing. John?
Any other question or discussion? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Motion by Wilson, second by Donna. I need all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? If no, the motion's, agenda item 5C is approved. We moved on to agenda item 5D, is on the consent calendar. Now we move on to 5E1, is consideration of adopting recommendation to the committee relating to the proposal amendment to the Chapter 22, Subchapter A, Section 22.1, new Section 22.9, 22.11 of Board Rules concerning general provision. Dr. Charles Pearl, Assistant Commissioner for Student Financial Aid, will provide some brief remarks and will be available to answer any questions. Please. Go ahead, sir, Doctor.
These particular rules are focused on strengthening the general provisions that relate to all of the financial aid programs that we oversee. We did receive a few comments from institutions. Several of those comments actually helped point out some unnecessary complication that we had included in the rules, and so we will actually be removing that complication. And then one rule was submitted that had suggested including all attempted hours, but in reviewing how GPAs are calculated, we realized that we would be looking at all completed as opposed to all attempted.
Any questions or discussion, please? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So move.
Motion by Donna, second by Wilson. I need all in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
Any nays? Agenda item 5E is approved. We move on to agenda item 5E2 through 8. Proposal rules are on the consent calendar. 5E9 is consideration of adopting Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to the proposal of repeal of Chapter 23, Subchapter E, Section 23.124 and 23-130 Board Rules concerning the Dental Education Loan Repayment Program. Dr. Charles Pearl, Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Student Financial Aid, will provide some brief remarks and are available to any questions, please.
Our practice is to repeal rules for programs that haven't been funded over several biennium, and so that's why we're repealing the Dental Education Loan Repayment Program. We did receive a comment raising concerns about repealing the rule. In our response, we did point out that our repeal of the rule has no impact on the fact that this program still exists in statute, and should the program ever be funded, we would reinstate rules appropriately. But we do try to repeal the rules for programs that are no longer active so as to provide clearer information to the public about active programs.
Any questions or discussion, please? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So moved.
Second.
Second. Motion by Wilson and second by Donna. I need all in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion 5E9 is approved. We move to agenda item 5, 10, and 11. Proposed rules are on the consent calendar. Agenda item 6 is adjournment. Following the adjournment, we'll take 5 minutes break to allow staff to set up for the cause meeting. Do I have a motion?
So move. This is Donna.
Okay, so Donna, motion by Donna, second by Wilson. This committee has come to adjournment. We'll take a 5-minute break so they can adjust the seatings. Please, thank you.
So you still see things